That's in the world.
Yeah, always have in a couple weeks.
Okay, today I want to talk about the letter on humanism, Heidegger's letter on humanism. This is a very delicate subject, particularly right now among academic humanists who, of course, resent being identified as humanists in the sense that Heidegger is identifying the humanist tradition. Very contested, very inflammable situation, totally unresolved, and for this reason, this essay is very necessary to understand what Heidegger means by humanism in his, first of all, violent, well, I wouldn't say violent, but very strong critique of humanist tradition, Western humanist tradition. But also because Heidegger's essay triggered a whole momentum, anti-humanism, which is fundamental to the post-structure revolution, is anti-humanistic. So you can see, just on the basis of putting it that way, that we're dealing with a very touchy subject, which needs some degree of clarification. Heidegger's analysis of the humanist tradition Heidegger's analysis of the humanist tradition is based on, in a fundamental way, on the difference, the radical difference he finds in the concept of truth as it was understood by the Greeks, aletheia. I'll come back to that. On the one hand, and the Roman appropriation of this concept of truth, aletheia. Its appropriation was totally reduced what is essential in the Greek concept of truth. Aletheia means hyphen, as in ahistorical, letheia, which means basically forgetting. So that we could say aletheia Lethe, the Greek, the river where the souls are brought in, and it's the river of forgetting the former world. Or equally, concealment. Unforgetting or an unconcealment. That's what the Greeks meant by aletheia, their fundamental orientation toward the question of being, the truth of being. What Heidegger means by aletheia, unconcealment, is not unconcealment as such or a unforgetting as such, so that once something has been unconcealed, it becomes fixed in our minds and becomes a truth. That's not what he means by unconcealment. Unconcealment is an ongoing process. What is unconcealed gets concealed on the moment of its being unconcealed, so that it has to be always already unconcealed. So it is called the truth as a process of concealment, unconcealment, concealment, always already. Always already. That opposed to, so that unconcealment is a kind of erring, word I've been using in this class, kind of erring. It's a kind of hit or miss. Let's not think of hit or miss in terms of some kind of accidental process. This kind of hit or miss is profoundly rigorous for Heidegger, profoundly rigorous, because it required attention to being in a way that nothing else is capable of giving that attention to. It's a very highly disciplined, but that's not a good word. But I want to suggest that thinking in the Greek manner, aletheia, vis-a-vis the truth, requires enormous attention, not simply the mind, but the body itself, the whole body, the whole self. So, concealment, unconcealment. That because the Greeks were aware of the fact that if you left it at unconcealment, I now know what was obscure. I now know what's obscure. You fix that knowledge of what was obscure in such a way that it becomes a truth for all time, for universally. And that is exactly what truth is not for the Roman, for the Greeks. Because, as I've been saying, the question for the Greeks is more important than the answer. Possibility is more important. The term that Heidegger uses to refer to this in the essay, möglich, possibility. And I emphasize that as I've been emphasizing the concept of possibility throughout this course, because it is precisely that möglich, that sense of possibility in itself, unrelated or untethered to the act possibility in the act. Untethered to that what Agamben picks up from Heidegger and becomes fundamental to his whole orientation toward the question of being, thinking, and not least, of course, the community. According to let me backtrack just a little bit. To recall something that I said last time about the essence for Heidegger of what constitutes being human. I said that on the basis of his analysis of Dasein, being there, the human being in being in time, concludes that the essence, the existential essence in his existential analysis of being in time, of human being, Dasein, in being in time, the essence, the existential essence, the fundamental category of human being is his care, Sorge. O-R-G-E, Sorge, his care. In the sense that he is a insistent, existent being. He has something that the rest of being does not have, which is to say his consciousness. But this doesn't make him a matter, a deity, because his consciousness is absolutely tethered to, absolutely related to, and indissolubly so with his insistence. He can only be conscious so far. That's his condition. As a consequence, you can easily see, therefore, how easy it would be for man to decide, well, since I've got my consciousness, and stones don't, or nature doesn't, then I am nature's master, the master of trees, plants, animals, stones, so on. So I am. And of course, what Heidegger is saying in the ontotheological tradition is that interpretation of man that has become predominant in the time of the Romans. More complicated than that, but that's ground zero. Whereas from the Heideggerian point of view, this condition of being existent, insistent, ontic, ontological, conscious, and unconscious, physical, places an enormous burden. There's a lot of difference between being a master and placing burden on humanity. And the burden, of course, is his responsibility, his responding to being in all its manifestation, his being the caretaker of being. There's an enormous difference between those master and caretaker, as put up. The very first paragraph of the letter on humanism. Language is the house of being. In it, its home, man dwells. Those who think and those who create with words are the guardians of this home. Their guardianship accomplishes the manifestation of being insofar as they bring the manifestation to language and maintain it in language through speech. Thinking does not become action only because some effect issues from it or because it is applied. That's what has happened to language in the modern humanistic dispensation. It's become instrumental. It's become, and we'll see next time, technological, a mode of enframing being with all the implications of transforming it, reducing it to a picture that is graspable. Thinking does not become action only because some effect issues from it or because it is applied. Thinking acts. Thinking is an action in itself, acts insofar as it thinks. So, what I'm emphasizing is, of course, the continuity between the ontological condition, as the Greeks understood it, or as Heidegger claims the Greeks understood it, and the imperative of responsibility, of caring. Another word that will be bouncing around in this class quite a bit, we have already, although I haven't given it very much emphasis, is the word, it's a phrase, interest. Interest. That's a profoundly loaded term that has a lot of consequences, particularly in modern Western civilized, particularly by way of the transformation of theological thinking to empirical thinking, where the true observer, the true producer of knowledge is he or she who is disinterested, detached, objective, so on and so forth. Whereas, and which from Heidegger's point of view means a separation in the metaphysical sense, a separation of human being from that which he observes, so that he can master it. Objectivity is just the absolute antithesis, Heidegger showed, from what it is intended to be. It is a mode of mastery. We're going to see that in essay on technology, particularly essay on technology. A mode of mastery. Disinterested is a mode of mastery. Ironically, therefore, interestedness is a mode of that demands an entirely different orientation than the art of care. An entirely different orientation than that of mastery. It comes, and Heidegger is very much aware of it. He gets it from Kierkegaard. I forget exactly where Kierkegaard. But anyway, where Kierkegaard says something to the effect that human being is always interesting. Interesting. Latin. Being in the midst of things. In the midst. Being in the midst. This is where you must be. Kierkegaard said, and Heidegger picks up on this. That makes it fundamental to his concept, where he must be in the midst. In the midst, again, being insistent. That's what interest means for Heidegger. Interest means for Heidegger. In opposition to that kind of disinterestedness, which is celebrated as the only agency of truth in the modern empirical scientific tradition. The passage that I want to focus our primary attention on in the letter on humanism is a passage very brief but loaded and fundamental to Heidegger's thinking and to post-structuralist arrival, as you see as we go along. Is very brief, as I said, and it's a we can call it anticipating Foucault. We can call it the genealogy of modern humanism. Very brief, and so brief, therefore, that most scholars, Heideggerian scholars, even post-structuralists, have not paid enough attention to this particular passage, and to by way of explicating it for all the potentiality for understanding humanism both negatively and positively. In many ways, it's his own fault because he did not pursue it fully enough. What he says about humanism and its genealogy, except that although I'm going to point out another series of lectures that Heidegger gave during World War II, 1943, on the Parmenides, on the pre-Socratic Parmenides, in which he picks up where he left off, so brief comments in letter on humanism, to show that it is an issue in his mind. And as much as he resists it, it's an issue that he can't escape. Anyway, it's on page, it begins on page 200. Humanitas explicitly so called was first considered and striven for in the age of the Roman Republic. That's the beginning of the genealogy, of his genealogy, of humanism, as that term has come down to us and is so determinant of how we in the modern world understand being. He says, what he's saying here is that nothing to do with it's a Roman invention. But what's interesting is that he tries to tell us why the Romans invented humanism in opposition to Greek conception of being human, by being human. And in the process, of course, articulates a whole understanding of knowledge production throughout all its valence, throughout the continuum of being, from the concept of truth itself, all the way through the culture, all the way across to the political. The political is muted in this particular passage that we're going to be looking at, but is there. And I will show that it is increasingly there in the Essays on Parmenides, where he repeats this genealogy. Humanitas, explicitly so called, was first considered and striven for in the age of the Roman Republic. Homo humanus was opposed to Homo barbarus. That's a binary opposition that's fundamental to ontotheological thinking. The binary logic, us against them. And the enablement of the Roman Homo humanus to represent his other, no matter what, his other in the sense of being different from himself as a barbarian, as inferior. Homo humanus here means the Romans. This is a colonial imperial orientation. He doesn't pursue that, but it's there. The very fact that he invokes the term Homo humanus in opposition to Homo barbarus. By the way, this is controversial, but I think it's worth mentioning that the Greeks, the barbaros is a Greek term, barbaros. But I think what Heidegger is saying is that the Greeks did not understand the term barbarous, which they coined, barbarous, barbarian, in the sense of a impossible entity that justifies his or her colonization, which it does for the Romans. Barbarous means for the Greeks not barbarian in this sense of the word. It means stranger. That's a lot of difference between being a barbarian and being a stranger. So the term barbarian, at least there's a lot of reasons for saying it, is not Greek. Greeks had a much more tolerant attitude towards the stranger. It was always conflicted, always anxious situation, but much more open-ended. And this is one reason why, for example, Herodotus, the great historian who was so interested in Africans, Egyptians, Persians, and so on and so forth, lifestyle, life view, concepts of truth and so on and so forth. Why, in a later generation, Herodotus was called a philo-barbarian, a spouser of the barbarians. And of course, we're talking about a situation that is deeply impacted historically. You know, especially in the context of human study, in the sense that we all know, of course, that Western civilization has its basis in Greece. Greeks, of course, Homer, Herodotus, Plato, Aristotle, Euripides, and so on and so forth. But increasingly recently, that notion has been, as it should be, very severely challenged. And take a whole semester to pursue this line, we can't do it. But I can simply say that someone like a great historian, modern contemporary historian, Martin Bernard, wrote a book called Black Athena, in which he indicates, without making mention of Heidegger at all, indicates how Herodotus, how the Greeks were much more tolerant, much more open, much more multicultural than the concept of being civilized barbarous would imply. Being a barbarian would imply.
What was his name? This historiography?
Say that again?
What was the name of this?
Martin Bernard.
Yeah.
B-E-R-N-A-R. Which would tend to verify the origins of the etymological meaning of barbarity, the difference between being a stranger on the one hand, from a Greek perspective, and being an inferior on the other. The terms that the Romans used, whether it's Aeneas or whoever, and that whole moment of the rise of metropolitan Rome, the beginning of the European civilization, Western civilization, Occidental civilization. The Roman Homo humanus is invariably pitted against those who dwell in the provinces, who were called barbarians, but more specifically, Sylvestres, S-Y-L-V, as in Sylvan, the Sylvan scene, Sylvestres, which meant forest dwellers. They dwelled in the forest. They did not cultivate the land. They were nomadic. They did not cultivate the land. They did not fructify the land. They did not create civilization. They were not sedentary. To become civilized, you must become sedentary. Chop the trees down, plow the land, colonize the land. The Roman word for farmer who performs agriculture is colon. He's a farmer. He cultivates the land. Cultivates the land. You can see therefore the physical operation, the relationship between the physical operation on the one hand and the colonial on the other. This is not in Heidegger. This comes out of we're following Heidegger in the last decade or so. But you'll see that Heidegger is intuiting this connection between, say, cultivating the land and colonizing. Silvestris, which means in Latin, forest dweller. Someone who roams the forest, but also and absolutely simultaneously, it means savage. There's no separation between being a forest dweller and being a savage. I might also add, for the sake of bringing America into this whole play, it is precisely this distinction, Roman distinction in the 17th century, all the way through westward expansion to America, that determined the relationship between the colonizers, who bring the land to fructification, and on the one hand, and those who dwell and roam the forest, the vagabonds, as the Cooper calls them. The Indians were vagabonds. They were nomads. All the terms for unsedentary, these guys all used throughout the whole 19th century. So that's what I mean when I say this notion we're talking about vis-a-vis the contrast between Greek errancy and Roman humanism. Is enormously complex, deeply inscribed in the history of Western civilization. The one point that I would want to make, at least to you, that you will keep in mind as a possibility, is that from this Heideggerian and post-structuralist perspective, is that the entire history of Western civilization is infused, is inscribed by this Roman perspective. Through the theological period, for example, in the sense that the church in the medieval era modeled itself on the Roman Empire. You all know that. And had nothing to do with Greeks. Greeks had nothing to do with empire. And this is I'd be synectically in little suggested by the fact that, say, it's not Homer who vision of the world is taken over by Western civilization. It's Virgil. It's Virgil in the sense, for example, not only of the tremendous importance for Europe in the aftermath of the collapse of the Roman Empire of Virgil Aeneid. But as manifested, for example, in the period of Dante, when great, emblematic, exemplary text of Western civilization become the Divine Comedy, which, as you know, the beginning is not Homer that Dante invokes as the guide for the Christian, modern Christian, but Virgil. He woke one day, found himself lost in common, didn't know where he was at. He sees some light way up off in the distance, but in between is forest, darkness. He has no idea, and he cannot have any idea until this figure comes out of the darkness. He says, I will guide you. That figure is Virgil, the principle of history. And that would tell us a lot about, what the genealogy behind Western civilization is. Again, this is an enormously complicated and exacerbated by the fact that after the Middle Ages, of course, and the Protestant era, Virgil had his day, and the Greeks were recuperated in the 18th century by the Germans. But this is where Bernal comes in and says, but you've got to realize that the Germans who invoked Schiller, Goethe, all those great humanists, who invoked the origins of Western civilization in Rome, in Greece, were reading the Greeks, Homer, Euripides, and so on and so forth, Sophocles, from the point of view of the Roman perspective, not from the Greek. This is what the point that Bernal makes. And my own examination of this whole era over the period of 20 years ago, when I was deeply involved in this whole genealogical question of Western civilization. I was doing work on Matthew Arnold, and of course you know that Matthew Arnold is a great exponent of Greek civilization as a model for the coming world. And my analysis makes it very, very clear that it's not the Greeks. The Greeks understood as error, but the Greeks understood from a Roman, humanistic Roman perspective that he was talking about. So again, this is very complicated, but this equation, or this context, has to put back into play in any discussion of humanism, any discussion of genealogy of humanism. However you finally decide on this, I think it's your responsibility to be aware of these contradictions in humanism. And I would go even farther to say the primacy of the Roman model. It's not accidental. Again, for example, T.S. Eliot wrote at the end of his life, although at the end of his life, earlier at the end of his life, some essays on Virgil, claiming him to be the true father of Western civilization. Virgil. And the Okay, so Homo humanus was opposed to Homo barbarum. Homo humanus meant the Romans who exalted and honored Roman virtus through the embodiment of the paideia, education, culture too, means paideia means culture, taken over from the Greeks. I want to pause a minute on the word virtus, which of course has a very rich, complex etymological history. It comes, first of all, from the Latin word from man, vir, man. So human, in the first place, is understood by the Romans as man, as opposed, for example, to women, or to any other species, human species. It also means virtue in the sense of goodness, virtue in that sense of the word. Man equals someone who, if he's manly, he's virtuous. And also means power. Virtuous meaning power, potential, power. Those three aspects is what are contained in that word. That's why Heidegger uses it. Means the Roman who exalted and honored Roman virtues through the embodiment of the paideia, education, taken over from the Greeks. Then he goes on to explain that this does not mean that the origins of humanism is in Greece. It's in the Roman interpretation or representation. These were the Greeks of the Hellenistic age. These are not the Greeks that Heidegger refers to, Homer, Euripides, Sophocles, even Aristotle and Plato. These are the Romans of the first century. These are the Greeks of the Hellenistic age. That's the first century, which had abandoned the errant dynamics of truth discarded here by their forebears. These were the Greeks of the Hellenistic age, whose culture was acquired in the schools of philosophy. You remember, of course, that Plato and the Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, they went down into the agora and taught. They didn't have institutions of education. They did not formalize knowledge production. They thought, at least it's the idealization, Heideggerian idealization, they thought. It was free inquiry. Nothing was at stake. Nothing was at stake except being. Nothing was at stake in the sense of getting something done, finding answers to. It was a matter of questioning, of thinking the wonder precipitated by the being of being. At the end of the Greek period, schools of philosophy were formulated in the first century, second century AD, and they're fundamentally tied to the Roman, the imperial triumph of Rome over the world, the It was concerned, these were the Greeks of the Hellenistic period, whose culture was acquired in the schools of philosophy. It was concerned with eruditio et institutio in bonus arte. You know, the phrase we all, the humanists, refer to, the fine arts. But what it really means is scholarship and training in good conduct. Scholarship and training in good conduct. That's what makes the object of education virtuous. Man, powerful, and good. Instituto in bonus arte, scholarship and training in good conduct. And this, of course, although Heidegger doesn't mention it here, I'm going to pick up on this when I go over to the Parmenides lecture. You can see, if you understand this homo romanus equals homo humanus as man in relationship to Rome's project in the world, Rome's imperial project in the world, Rome's metropolitan perspective of the world, then you will see that education in scholarship and education in good means the production, and I use that word very specifically and pointedly, production. You produce good, dependable citizens to do the work of empire, to respond to the calling of the higher metropolitan cause. Who will give his life to the imperial project. That's not here, but once I say this, you can't escape it. But as I'll show in the Parmenides lecture, it is stated overtly. This is one of the things that's so agonizing about Heidegger, why he didn't pursue this further. So crucial. Somewhere along the line he backed off. I don't know. Anyway, so the one point that I want to make, which I should have made just a little bit earlier, vis-a-vis Greek notion of truth as I would appear. The Romans, in contrast, represented this, felt very uneasy about this kind of concealment, unconcealment that gets nowhere, or that's the way they read it, gets nothing accomplished. It's a kind of thinking that seems just to be for its own sake. So they took the Greek concept over, but in the process reduced it to an orientation towards being, which had as its fundamental purpose getting answers from it. And that term is a term that is the model, for example, of Harvard University, veritas, truth. In Roman, in Latin, the truth equals veritas. And what it meant was, as Heidegger insistently all through Being in Time and other essays throughout his entire career. Put it, and adequatio intellectus et re, the adequation of mind and thing. That's such a far cry from aletheia. Adequation of mind and thing, or to reduce something very complicated to a simple term, correctness. Correctness. The true from the false. That's the world that Rome bequeathed us, and the world that has been fundamental vis-a-vis thinking, vis-a-vis the truth, and political from that time on, what Heidegger is saying, and the post-structuralists are saying. That's the disclosure, the eventual disclosure of the post-structuralists by way of Heidegger. And that's why they're all anti-humanist. I'll come back to this. So they're anti-human, but are they really anti-human? That's another very different story. It's not the same thing. Because what I want to suggest is they were Heidegger and his followers and post-structuralists were pursuing a terrific different understanding of the human than that came down and became hegemonized in the Western tradition, particularly in the period of the Renaissance, which unfolded in the form of the Enlightenment and modernity. Paideia, Paideia understood as eruditio et institutio in bonus artis, scholarship in good conduct, has as its point of departure the reduction of aletheia to veritas, to the true and the false. Paideia, thus understood, was translated as humanitas. The genuine romanitas of Homo Romanus consisted in such humanitas, i.e., human equals being oriented by adequatio intellectus re, correctness, true and false, and thus, by implication, a servant to a higher cause. We encounter the first humanism in Rome. The Greeks had no word for humanism, for Heidegger. It therefore, whereas the Romans used it all the time, it therefore remains in essence, a specifically Roman phenomenon, which emerges from the encounter of Roman civilization with the culture of the late Greek civilization. The so-called Renaissance, the European Renaissance, of the 14th and 15th century in Italy is a Renascentia Romanitatis. We all know this. The Renaissance was the recuperation after the so-called Dark Ages of antiquity, the literature of antiquity. But the literature of antiquity mediated by its translation by the Romans. Almost all the texts that Shakespeare read, that Sidney read, and so on and so forth, were Roman text translations of Greek text. Only rarely, but even those texts the Greek texts that emerged in their own language were mediated by the Roman perspective. That's what Heidegger means when he said that the so-called Renaissance of the 14th and 15th century in Italy is a relicentia Romanitatis. Because Romanitas is what matters. It is concerned with humanitas and therefore with Greek idea. But Greek civilization is always seen in the light in the later form. And this itself is seen from a Roman point of view. The Homo Romanus of the Renaissance, and then a very quick, rapid, all too rapid, one wishes so much he had expanded on that few lines. But they're so concise that it's very easy to infer what he means by this, by what he says in this very laconic way. But Greek civilization is always seen in its later form, and this itself is seen from the Roman point of view. The Homo Romanus of the Renaissance also stood in opposition to Homo Barbarus, but now the inhumane is a supposed barbarism of Gothic scholasticism in the Middle Ages. Therefore, a studium humanitatis, which humanist study, which in a certain way reaches back to the ancients and thus also becomes a rival of Greek civilization, always adheres to historically understood humanism. Always adhere to historically understood humanism. That is to say, genealogically, its origins are Rome. For the Germans, and this may be sound like just a kind of reflection on our participation, our German participation, but it means more than that because it was the Germans who retrieved in the 18th century through Winkelmann, Goethe, Schiller, Schelling, and so on, Schlegel, and so on and so forth, the Greek, the return to the Greeks in a kind of way that they thought was going back truly to the Greeks, but who were in fact representing these Greeks from a Roman imperial perspective. They're highly visible retrieval of the Greeks in the 18th century, and by, of course, by way of the Germans in England, France, especially in England, 18th century revival, classical Greek civilization. Mediated through the eyes of Rome. And this is especially prominent in the role that they gave the Aryan race to the Greeks of ancient Greece, and triggered the identification of Aryan Greece with Nazism. It's unfair to invoke, to identify Winkelmann, Goethe, and Schiller with Nazism. That's not the point that I want to make. But insofar as they do not think the distinction between the Greek aletheia and the Roman veritas, they put themselves in a situation where they can be interpreted as founders of National Socialist Nazis and whole Aryan race perspective. And that, again, this is not me, this is Heidegger, and a lot of the constructive. It also is a momentum that is of analysis, historical analysis that is emerging, has become emergent, particularly by way of the influence of Martin Bernal's Black Athena. For Germans, this is apparent in the humanism of the 18th century, supported by Winkelmann, Goethe, and Schiller. On the other hand, Hölderlin, the great German poet, Heidegger, does not belong to humanism precisely because he thought the destiny of human man's effort in a much more original way than humanism could. Humanism, in other words, is a second-class phenomenon, is a derivative phenomenon. It derives from the Greek, from the original. And in the process of deriving from it, it annuls the original. This is why Heidegger says that his project of being in time, and virtually ever after, had to do with retrieval, the origins of the civilization. The retrieval, precisely in this sense of retrieving what the process of mediating an original insight has reduced for positive thought. What I've been focusing on, what I've been emphasizing in the process is the continuity between the ontological concept of truth and those more obviously political sites of a continuum being. What I suggested, I'm pretty sure I think it was pretty clear about that. What I suggested by way of reading this particular passage of genealogical paradigms is how Heidegger's insight into humanism is simultaneously an ontological one involving truth, but also one involving education. Let's call that, or paideia, let's call that education or culture. Culture, the site of education and culture. And by implication, as I suggest, political in the sense of it is precisely this orientation of being which enables and justifies colonization of barbarians. You have to think of these sites simultaneously. One of the disasters of modern knowledge production, however triumphant it has been, is precisely the disciplining of these sites, where you talk about science, the truth of science, independently of political, the cultural, and so on and so forth. And how considerably, this notion of discipline and disciplining knowledge will become increasingly important, particularly when it comes to growth and emphasizing. But anyway, again, I'm giving a lot of attention to these two passages of Heidegger in order to suggest that what I've been talking about is radical potential is there in Heidegger. Anti-colonial, all that binary opposition, only belonging, which is involved binary opposition, us against them, so on. But I also want to admit that in the context of the larger Heideggerian whole, they don't have the kind of force that seems to me that they need. And that's primarily because Heidegger, for some reason or other, I can't fathom, did not pursue the potentiality of this ocean continuum. And one of the points that I want to make is that's why I'm teaching a course that's physics in order to show how necessary this relationality between the sites of the ontological political are, how necessary thinking these sites as a continuum are. But also as well to show that this is already being done, this is now being done by what I've been calling force structures, by the order of Lacan and so on and so forth. What was called last time, what had been called by some the left Heideggerian groups last time. Anyway, the second passage that I want to focus on, when my time is up, what time is it now?
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock? Oh, that time is up. So no point beginning. But next time I want to look carefully at this passage from the Parmenides which repeats it, but now is much more specific, which identify the truth of Rome, Roman truth, literature, rules, imperial pride, the metropolitan pride. The word, by the way, metropolis, which is so fundamental to the very idea of Rome, means the city that measures. It measures all the other peoples that are outside the metropolitan area. That's one thing. The other thing that's worth thinking about when we talk about the metropolis, Rome, the colonizing metropolis, is that it is understands itself as the center of the global context, and therefore justify the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, by way, of course, of conquest. And of course, the inheritor of this Roman Pax Romana, of course, is the United States, particularly since the war. That was a term that the Bush administration used all through its 8 years of the rule of the United States.